I still remember the exact moment everything went sideways. I was duct-taped to a rusted lawn chair in my own barn, blindfolded with what felt like a dish towel that smelled of mildew and lavender, while two men in what I could only describe as discount security uniforms argued over whether to use the taser on me again or just call someone they kept referring to as Karen. The sound of a weed whacker idled somewhere in the distance, and I heard one of them shout something about checking if I had signed a variance form. Then came the sharp crack of what sounded like a stun baton hitting metal. And somehow, unbelievably, all of this chaos was about a shed I was converting into a guest house. 3 months before this insane situation, I had been living a completely different life. My name is Todd Rener, and I'm a history teacher who decided to escape the noise of city life. I bought this beautiful but run-down farmhouse just outside a pristine suburb called Willow Pines. The property had been abandoned for years, with overgrown fields and a barn that had seen better days. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted some peace, maybe a few chickens, and the chance to grow vegetables without someone complaining about the aesthetics of my tomato cages. The realtor had assured me that being outside the official town limits meant no HOA restrictions, no committees, no busybodies telling me what color to paint my mailbox. That turned out to be technically true, but reality had other plans in the form of Sharon Wexley, though everyone called her Char. Char lived 3 properties over, but she acted like she owned the entire zip code. She was the self-appointed chairwoman of something she called the Willow Pines Adjacent Beautification Task Force, which was essentially a fake HOA she had invented to harass anyone within a 5-mile radius of her perfectly manicured property. This woman was a retired cruise ship magician who had apparently decided that making rabbits disappear wasn't enough power for one lifetime. Now she wanted to make property rights vanish too. Her business cards, which she handed out liberally, read aesthetic compliance is not optional in bold Comic Sans font. The first time she showed up at my door, driving a golf cart that had been modified with a CB radio antenna and a rotating amber light on top, I thought it was some kind of elaborate prank. The harassment started small, with handwritten letters in glitter gel pen that would appear in my mailbox at odd hours. The first one informed me that my barn roof was reflecting sunlight in a way that disrupted avian migration patterns and demanded I repaint it immediately in something called dusty egret, which she claimed was an HOA-approved color. I ignored it, thinking this was just one crazy neighbor who would eventually get bored and move on to bothering someone else. But Char wasn't the type to give up easily. The letters became more frequent and increasingly absurd. One claimed my compost pile was creating an unauthorized ecosystem. Another stated that my scarecrow was positioned in an illegal configuration that violated the Rural Aesthetic Guidelines, a document that I later discovered she had written herself and tried to file with the county clerk's office. When the letters didn't work, Char escalated to personal visits. She would arrive unannounced, always in that ridiculous golf cart, wielding a pair of binoculars and a clipboard. She would circle my property like a vulture, taking photos and making notes. Once, she actually called the fire department claiming I had an uncontrolled burn happening on my property. It was my barbecue grill. The firefighters were not amused. Another time, she reported me to animal control for keeping exotic animals without a permit. The exotic animals in question were 3 Rhode Island red chickens named Mabel, Dorothy, and Beatrice. The animal control officer actually laughed when he saw them and told me this was the 3rd false report from the same number that month. Then came the guards, and this is where things shifted from annoying to genuinely concerning. 2 local men, both in their 40s and clearly enjoying their newfound authority, began showing up on my property wearing surplus military gear with homemade patches that read WPPSS, which stood for Willow Pines Perimeter Security Squad. They had laminated badges that looked like they were made at a copy shop, 2-way radios that crackled constantly, and they had set up what they called checkpoint chickweed at the end of my driveway. At first, I thought they were just playing dress-up, maybe some kind of neighborhood watch gone wrong. But then they started issuing fines, actual envelopes with dollar amounts written on official-looking forms. One fine was for possession of non-decorative hay. Another was for failure to maintain suburban agricultural standards. The amounts ranged from $50 to $300, and they would tape them to my door if I didn't answer. I tried reasoning with them, explaining that I wasn't part of any HOA, that this was private property, and that they had no legal authority to fine me for anything. They just smiled and told me to take it up with the boss, meaning Char. When I went to the actual police, they said unless the guards physically threatened me or damaged my property, it was a civil matter. The officer suggested I just ignore them, that they would probably get bored and move on. But I could see in his eyes that even he thought the whole situation was bizarre. I started documenting everything with my phone, taking pictures of the guards, keeping copies of all the fake finds, recording our interactions when they showed up. Little did I know how important that evidence would become. Everything exploded when I decided to convert part of my old barn into a guest house. It was my property, my barn, and I had all the proper permits from the actual county. But Char claimed it violated something she called the Historical Facade Vibe Ordinance, a document she had typed up herself in Comic Sans font and decorated with clip art of houses and trees. She showed up at my door waving this paper like it was the Constitution, demanding I cease all construction immediately. When I actually laughed in her face, she turned red and told me I had no idea who I was messing with. She said she had connections, that she could make my life very difficult, and that I would regret not taking her seriously. I told her to get off my property, and she left, but not before making a big show of taking photos of the barn from every angle. 3 nights later, I woke up to the sound of metal cutting through chain. The guards had arrived with bolt cutters and were breaking through my gate lock. I grabbed my phone and immediately started recording as I went outside to confront them. They claimed they were serving a citizen's zoning arrest, which is not a real thing that exists anywhere in American law. When I tried to explain this to them, one of them pulled out what looked like a stun baton and zapped my electric fence, shorting it out completely. They pushed past me into the barn, and before I knew what was happening, they had grabbed me and were wrapping duct tape around my wrists. One of them produced that dish towel I mentioned earlier and tied it around my head as a blindfold, while the other dragged over an old lawn chair from the corner of the barn. What these amateur commandos didn't know was that I had installed a Nest Cam in the barn just a week earlier, specifically because of their escalating harassment. The camera was streaming live to my Facebook page, where I had been documenting the entire saga for my friends and family. Within minutes, the stream had been shared dozens of times, and viewers were flooding in. The comment section exploded with outrage as people watched 2 grown men in fake security uniforms hold me hostage in my own barn while discussing whether they should call Karen, who I assumed was Char using some kind of code name. My sister, who happens to be an attorney with a particular fondness for both litigation and late-night social media scrolling, was watching from her apartment 2 states away. She immediately called 911 and gave them my address, explaining that she was watching a live stream of her brother being held against his will. The beauty of live streaming is that it captures everything, including the guards using my name, discussing their plan to force me to sign over property rights, and even mentioning Char by name several times. They had no idea they were being broadcast to what had grown to over 1,400 viewers, including a retired judge who lived in the next town over, 3 ex-Marines who were already getting in their trucks to come help, and multiple people who were calling the police. The guards were still debating what to do with me when we heard the sirens. Multiple sirens, actually, because my sister hadn't just called 911, she had also called the FBI field office and reported a kidnapping in progress, complete with video evidence. The guards tried to run when they heard the sirens, but they didn't get far. One tripped over my wheelbarrow in the dark and knocked himself unconscious. The other made it to their van but was surrounded by police cars before he could even start the engine. I was freed by a very confused but professional sheriff's deputy who kept asking if this was some kind of prank or reality show. When I explained the whole situation, he just shook his head and said in 20 years of law enforcement, he had never seen anything quite like this. The guards were arrested on multiple charges including criminal restraint, impersonating law enforcement, trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault. One of them actually started crying when they put the real handcuffs on him. The very next morning, law enforcement descended on Char's house with a search warrant. What they found was beyond anything I could have imagined. She had filing cabinets full of forged code enforcement notices, not just for me but for dozens of neighbors over the years. There were detailed records of over $3,200 in compliance fees she had collected from intimidated residents who actually believed she had some kind of authority. They found a binder labeled Operation Turf Conquest that contained hand-drawn maps of the entire area with properties marked for acquisition, along with surveillance photos of numerous homes, including mine. There were even recordings of her coaching the guards on what to say and how to act official. She had uniforms, badges, and equipment she had purchased online, turning her garage into some kind of command center for her fake HOA operations. Char was arrested while wearing a silk kimono and Crocs, which somehow made the whole scene even more surreal. As they led her to the police car, She was shouting about property values and threatening to curse every raised garden bed in the county. She claimed she was protecting the neighborhood from people like me who didn't understand the importance of aesthetic unity. She actually told the officers that she was doing God's work by maintaining suburban standards in rural areas. One of the guards, trying to cut a deal, revealed that Char had promised them 10% of any property they helped her acquire through intimidation. He admitted on record that they thought it was like live-action role-playing but for real estate, which might be the most accurate description of this whole insane situation. The trial was swift and decisive. The prosecution had hours of video evidence, boxes of forged documents, and multiple witnesses who had been harassed over the years. My live stream had been viewed over 2 million times by the time it went to trial, making it impossible for Char to claim this was all a misunderstanding. The guards both took plea deals and testified against her. One of them actually apologized to me in court, saying he thought they were just playing pretend and didn't realize they were committing actual crimes until the real police showed up. The jury deliberated for exactly 19 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Char was convicted of extortion, fraud, conspiracy, and orchestrating criminal restraint. The judge called her actions a delusional power trip that had terrorized an entire community. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 200 hours of community service, which the judge specifically ordered to be served with the county's actual beautification department. When the sentence was read, Char's face went from red to white to a shade of purple I didn't know was humanly possible. She stood up and screamed that we would all regret this when our property values plummeted without her oversight, and then she fainted dramatically, requiring medical attention before they could take her into custody.